According to reports, the US has finally told China it's us or Russia. And it seems like China knows who the real big dog is. We're going to talk about how this came to pass and why the US chose now to finally get serious about China's support of the Russian war machine. I'm Paul, US Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a really interesting story for a bunch of reasons. First off, Chinese banks, according to Reuters, have finally started en masse ceasing transactions with Russia. Now, what's interesting is that we know that major Chinese banks stopped transacting with Russia kind of unofficially several months ago because those major Chinese banks wanted access to US dollar deals. But smaller local Chinese banks continued to conduct business with the Russians simply because local banks didn't need access to US dollars or to facilitate dollar-backed transactions, right? They're local banks. Of course, that caused a whole new set of issues as these banks weren't really equipped to handle the large-scale transactions that these sort of import-export deals often entail. Right? Imagine you're a bank that does home mortgages, right, of $500,000, and all of a sudden someone knocks on your door and goes, "Hey, listen, we need to facilitate a $50 million transaction of sophisticated electronics from China to paid to a Russian firm, and then rubles coming back." That bank will go, "Listen, that's like all the money we have." So there was a whole bunch of issues around that, but now even some of the smaller banks are getting on board with this sanction system. Now, again, as we talked about, by about the middle of 2024, by about June, Chinese banks were returning about 80% of Russian payments. But there reportedly even more of these transactions are getting spiked, and even some of Russia's workarounds, for example, like using banks in the UAE, have started rejecting transactions from Russian companies. And that, of course, is likely because the U.S. has told the UAE, listen, you can't be a part of this either. There's been all sorts of schemes that Russia has had to pull out to try to make this work. For example, they were smuggling gold to Hong Kong, where the gold would then be sold to a Chinese bank. So many different schemes that the Russians have used. And the result, of course, while Russia is a truly expert state at cutting through sanctions, these sanctions and their workarounds raise a lot of costs for these deals, right? And so now at this point, the reports are that the average solution, the average workaround runs about 6% of a total transaction, right? This is up from basically nothing beforehand. So, the source, at least one source to the Daily Star, said, for many small companies, this means a complete shutdown. And so the Kremlin, of course, acknowledges the problem, but doesn't really want to admit the scope and scale of it. But it is true that, as they point out, these Russian and Chinese transactions are completely codependent. There are no other major suppliers of many types of industrial equipment besides China, thanks to the sanctions, right? So, this is simply a sign, again, that the U.S. is sending the clear message. Quote, guys, if you continue to work with Russia, we will cut off your access to our market and choke your oxygen supply. And this is, the question, though, is why did this take 2.5 years to get to this point? And before we talk about that, of course, if you feel like you need to circumvent the exhausting sanctions, I don't know, hopefully you're not being sanctioned by Russia, you may just need some more caffeine, right? That's why you want to check out Strike Gum. It's Labor Day. We got a Labor Day sale for Strike Gum. You guys know it. It's the energy drink alternative. 0 sugar, easy to chew, don't have to spend $5 on an energy drink, and orders over $50, get free shipping in the U.S. That's 2 of these 5-packs, by the way. That's what I'm really think is the deal to get here. Or, of course, you could, if you're international, you just get 20% off any order over $50. So, don't miss it. Get your strike gum at strikegum.com and use promo code LaborDay24. Fun fact, the promo code LaborDay24 also gives you 10 to 20% off on Combat Vet News memberships. So get your strike gum, get energized, and then if you want to support the channel and the team, go over to Combat Vet News, pick up your memberships for 20% off. Okay, let's talk about the why. Why the U.S. chose now? Well, the answer is not that hard to figure out. It's this. As you can see, this is a chart of the annualized inflation rate every single month dating back to June of 2020. And as you can see, during the COVID era, the economy was in collapse. Not only prices were in danger of falling, and then slowly we started to see, again, just an absolute, a minor recovery as things stabilized. And then eventually, you saw the money printer turn on. And in the United States, inflation started to look dangerously high. You saw by June of 2022, right, just a few months after Russia invaded Ukraine, that global prices and prices in the United States were 10% higher than they had been 12 months prior. That is a dangerous level of inflation, right? Because once you have something like this, many consumers sit there and go, well, if prices are up 10% in the past 2 years or year and a half, what if they can, I'm going to pre-account for future inflation prices. And they say, okay, well, and that drives inflation further and further as people start to expect it. And so the United States could take no actions that would jeopardize their ability to fight inflation. Because again, the United States' final and most important mandate is to protect U.S. voters. That's who puts politicians in office. So, given this massive inflation spike, what did that mean? That meant that if you supplied anything to the United States, that we were not going to mess with you. Can you imagine how bad it would have been if there was 10% inflation and then we announced a series of tariffs on China, making every single Chinese good 10 to 20% more expensive? It would cause an inflationary crisis. This already was kind of on the edge of crisis level. And so China knew. They said, listen, the U.S. is never going to sanction us. They're never going to refuse our business. They need us too much. And so therefore, we can do business with Russia all day. And China had its own problems. While we have rapid inflation, the struggling Chinese economy, propped up by its wacky real estate sector, was actually experiencing deflation. That is, prices were falling, not just inflating slower, right, but actually falling to lower levels, which of course means consumption is going to plummet, right? It's a virtuous cycle or an unvirtuous cycle. And so the Chinese were just desperate to make deals happen. But two things have happened, right? So they said, listen, we need to do business with anybody we can in order to keep our economy propped up. So June 2022, nobody was willing to actually, not China and not the United States, was willing to tell Russia to go pound sand. Their money was just as good in China as it was in Moscow. But a lot has changed in 2 years. See, 2 years later, U.S. inflation firmly under control and falling. See, March of 24, 3.5%, but now we're printing inflation numbers under 3%. Extremely healthy print. And what that means is that the United States, that couldn't possibly dream of hitting China with sanctions, raising Chinese prices, now can sit there and go, well, inflation's licked, guys. And not only that, but the Chinese economy is also beginning to show signs of recovery. So China can sit there and go, we don't need these Russian transactions. They're not that large a portion of our whole economy. And the United States can sit there and go, we can afford to hit you harder. We can afford to be more punishing to China for its support of the Russian war machine. And so this perfect storm, I think, is starting to get both of sides, both China and Russia, to say, listen, or both China and the United States to say, listen, if we can only choose one trading partner, it's not going to be Russia, whose economy is like, a tenth, a third, maybe the size of the United States, right? The answer is a no-brainer, because China ultimately does not care about Russia. They don't care about the United States. They only care about China, which is a perfectly fair mentality for a country to have. But the biggest takeaway is, again, that the calculus has changed. And now the U.S. can put the squeeze on China and hopefully cut Russia off from its only major supplier of industrial goods. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. A huge thank you to our Colonel tier members, Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, as well as all of our lieutenant tier folks. I really could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see all of you guys in the next one. Cheers. Oh, and hit subscribe. Can't forget to hit subscribe.